I'm back. Not everyone else is there, I can see. The diehards are left in the room. This paper has morphed to such a degree because the more I researched the topic, the bigger the topic became. So what you're going to hear today has actually turned out to be my preliminary findings, which will ultimately form my PhD in law, because it's huge. There are going to be lots of areas that are perhaps controversial, and that's the point. Otherwise, why would you all be here? It would just be boring. All right, so the topic is, let me give you a bit of background. We're all passionate about wildlife, I'm sure, in this room, and I wanted to see what I could do as a lawyer to help the decimation of our species. And so I started writing and researching and writing research. I spent a week at CITES. I interviewed many, many people and looked at the law. And now I'm an environmental lawyer, and this has so much other law involved in it that, in fact, the University of the Free State had to turn my research intent away because they said they didn't have enough supervisors in enough areas of law to help me. So it's covering international criminal law, it covers criminal law, administrative law, environmental law, wildlife law. It's big. So I'm just going to start, and let's see how we go. Okay, I was told not to put too much information on one slide, but I did this on purpose, except it's not working. Oh. Thank you. Okay, this is what I've been looking at. This is the law that currently governs our wildlife. So you would think, initially when I started, I thought there wouldn't be too much, because it seems to be, we've got a rhino poaching issue, a lion issue, a elephant issue, a pangolin issue. We've got surely there can't be that much governing it. I was wrong. There's a lot. What must I do again? Resume. No, it's not there now. Sorry. I am pressing the down button, just in case you're all wondering. You could just stand here. Yeah, that's it. But it's not here, look. They're not matching, so what is on my screen isn't on there.
If you can, just press the down and look over there.
Okay. Okay. All right, so we've got all of this legislation. Why? Because currently, national and provincial spheres of government have concurrent legislative competence when it comes to Schedule 4 of the Constitution. Very legalese, but that means animal controlled environment and nature conservation fall within Schedule 4, which means it's dual competence run by provincial legislature and national. Okay, so we've got all this provincial legislation, and I'm scared to go back a slide in case I can't come back this way again. But we've got all that provincial legislation, and we've got the national legislation, and every provinces are doing this, and nationals doing this, and it's all trying to govern our wildlife. Okay, so for example, the Derby-Groenewald matter, with most of it came from National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, so most of the charges against him. Section 57(1) deals with the restricted activities, and the restricted activities that he was charged with, for example, was illegal killing of rhino, illegal dehorning of rhino, illegal possession of rhino horn, illegal selling of rhino horns, illegal hunting of rhino, on and on and on. And also Section 101 2B, which is contravention of a permit. So that's the main charge-related issue under environmental legislation. And then Lima is the Limpopo, it happened to be there, Limpopo Environmental Management Act, which also had a prohibition against permits. But in every single province, there's a different one of those. So there'll be the Natal, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, all different. Aside from the environmental legislation, the illegal trafficking of wildlife is also dealt with under these acts, which are all criminal law issues. Prevention of Organized Crime Act, where things like money laundering comes into it, racketeering, acquisition, possession, or use of proceeds of unlawful activities. Even the Righteous Assemblies Act gets used for inducing other people to commit an offense. The Intimidation Act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act for fraud, customs and excise with regard to the horns leaving or the bones leaving the country, Medicine and Related Substances Act. Often people get caught with the illegal possession of drugs, veterinary drugs normally. So there's this enormous problem, mainly dealt with under provincial legislation and national. And my proposal is that it has to be escalated out of the provincial capacity to national capacity. How do we do that, given that it falls in Schedule 4 of the Constitution? Take it out of the Schedule 4 of the Constitution by making it a matter of national security, a threat to political and economic stability, which we know transnational organized crime, which this is a threat to national security. So it can no longer be managed at provincial level, nor by the Department of Environmental Affairs, but instead has to be the Department of Security in issues of international criminal law, the Department of Trade and Industry, and Customs and Border Management in relation to illegal trade, the Department of Justice in terms of the crimes being committed against the state. Proposed changes to the legislation, aside from that whammy, we need to define the crime. There's no definition of wildlife crime or wildlife trafficking anywhere. Without a definition of the crime, where are we going? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to do? So we need to define the crime somewhere. We need to include more aspects of wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking in the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. We need to include wildlife crime or wildlife trafficking in Part 2 of Schedule 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act with regard to minimum sentences, because at the moment there are no minimum sentences with regard to wildlife trafficking. The inclusion of wildlife in the definition of illicit goods in the Customs and Excise Act, and also to create buffer zones with specified activities that are allowed within these buffer zones that needs to be included in the Protected Areas Act. Yes. Okay, now, what about a whole new act? Why don't we consolidate things? We've got that first slide that I showed you with all that legislation, with the prosecutors trying to attack from all these different angles. What about a new one, the Prevention of Wildlife Trafficking Act? To consolidate and centralize the difficulty of dealing with crimes occurring in different provinces and under different national and provincial legislation. This act would be a national competency act. It would fall under the Department of Justice or police. Permitting matters relating to acquisition, export, hunting, possession, selling, transportation, killing of an endangered species, which currently fall within the provincial legislation, would fall under this new act instead. So when one province is doing one thing and another province is doing another thing, that would go away completely because it would now be one act with everyone complying or attempting to comply. Minimum requirements relating to areas which endangered species are kept, which we have none of at the moment. I think there might be something in KwaZulu-Natal, but nowhere else. This new act should include possession and or trafficking of live or dead species or parts thereof, issues around that. mandatory disclosure requirements by owners to provide information regarding numbers of horns and other animal parts. Mandatory destruction of horns, ivory, carcasses to prevent infiltration into the illegal trade market. Dealing and/or trade. Powers to arrest without a warrant. Rewards for information. It should also include relaxations of restrictions on disclosure of information. You know, I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but there are a lot of restrictions around disclosure when arresting someone or getting information, that those under these circumstances, similar to the Drug Trafficking Act, should be relaxed. There should be obligations to report certain information to the police, increased powers of police officials in terms of suspicious behavior, and one of the very controversial issues in law are presumptions. Similar to the Drug Trafficking Act, presumptions relating to possession, dealing, trade, and acquisitions of proceeds of crime. So, for example, if somebody is caught with a shop, somebody has a shop and they have rhino horn in it or ivory in it, we reverse the onus. So instead of having the presumption that you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, the onus is reversed. So you assumed to be in possession or dealing or trading in that product unless you can prove otherwise. Very controversial. Got a nice constitutional cases that I could go on for hours, but so that's one of the controversial aspects of reversing the onus. The act should include perpetrators of violence or deliberate injury on animals to suffer penalties of adequate proportion. Offences, minimum, maximum, fine and imprisonment. Environmental legislation is quite good with that, but this needs to be incorporated into the criminal aspect. And it should include accomplices as well. This would repeal the provincial legislation and certain sections of NEMBA, and it would result in more focus on the prosecution of higher levels of the syndicates as opposed to simply the bottom level poachers, which is what we're struggling with at the moment. As well as all of that, there needs to be an incorporation of international criminal law, collaboration with range states, memorandums of understanding with range states. So this would create a standardization of wildlife legislation, hopefully. Although if CITES is anything to go by, it's quite hard to agree on these kind of things. Criminal sentences around the world for a more effective transnational capability. One of the main issues that came up in CITES was the lack of legislation in Vietnam for wildlife crime as well. So while we might have wildlife crime here, it's hard to prosecute on that end because there isn't similar legislation in place. And again, extradition treaties between countries so that we can extradite and where there's no legislation there, effectively prosecute here. More questions. So these are wild and wacky and will form part of a bigger paper and potentially my doctorate. But how do we get a community engagement and benefit into the scenario? Because it's definitely come out quite clearly that without community engagement and benefit, none of this is going to work. So the laws, how to change laws. Should community be allowed to do sustainable hunting or culling? Should they be excluded, but overseas trophy hunters be allowed to come in and pay a fortune to hunt, but the community gets excluded? So the legal ramifications and the mandates around that. The question of animals as property. In South Africa, animals are deemed to be property. So there's a whole debate, which I did my master's thesis on whether animals should be regarded as sentient in South African law. So change the legal standing of animals to protect them, and maybe initially change the legal standing of endangered species to protect them. Should animals be regarded as beneficiaries of the rights in the Bill of Rights and thus fall within the domain of its protection? And can the environmental right in the Bill of Rights be seen as sufficient for affording protection to individual animals? Each slide of this could be as a chapter to discuss. So it's just an overview of what I've worked out so far. I certainly don't have the answers. But desperate times mean desperate measures. So maybe the more extreme ideas should be the ones that are used. These preliminary findings form the basis of a paper to be published in the SA Crime Quarterly Journal next year in the first quarter, and hopefully ultimately a PhD, which will encompass all the debates around what I've presented to you today. Thank you.